Welcome to the Global News Podcast from the BBC. I'm Janat Jalil and I'm joined by our sports reporter Joe Lynskey. And Joe, the president of FIFA, Gianni Infantino, faces growing opposition from the football world after his now cancelled plan to sell off stakes in major tournaments like the World Cup. Tell us about the backlash.
Well, this has been a very fast-moving story since Tuesday last week, when those reports first emerged that Gianni Infantino was looking to sell off a subsidiary of the FIFA tournaments to private investors, essentially opening up the men's and women's World Cup and the Club World Cup to the pressures of kind of external investors and profit-driven football almost. And the backlash to that was driven really by UEFA, the governing body of football in Europe, who were really the first to come forward in terms of the confederations and have very sort of emotive and scornful rhetoric towards Gianni Infantino, to get us to a point now, 6 days on as we record from those first reports, where we are now in a position where those plans have been dropped. Infantino has admitted defeat. He would not have had the votes required to get those plans approved by the 211 FIFA member nations. The story now has shifted towards the future of the president himself, Gianni Infantino. He was due to be up for re-election in March of next year. And I think we can see just how big a gamble it was, because Infantino was set to stand in that election unopposed. He was due to potentially have a fourth term in office. But having done this last week, he has now opened himself up to challengers. We are now waiting to see what contenders might come forward. And some of those nations that wrote letters of support to Infantino in that uncontested election are now starting to withdraw those letters. We have already heard from the Football Association of Wales, who have done so, and England, the FA there, is also set to send a letter withdrawing their support for Infantino too. So yes, this has been very fast moving, and I think it's going to continue like that for the rest of the week.
And the controversies involving Gianni Infantino go back years.
Yes, well, Gianni Infantino has been in charge of FIFA for a decade. He took over from Sepp Blatter, who ended up in all sorts of bother at the end of his reign as FIFA president. And yes, so Infantino took over and he was sort of bestowed with those controversial World Cup host countries of Russia and Qatar in 2018 and 2022. But ahead of that tournament in 2022, we saw him really first start to emerge as a kind of controversial and public figure. We had that now notorious "Today I Feel" speech ahead of that World Cup, where, facing backlash around the treatment of migrant workers in Qatar, around the treatment of LGBT individuals there, Infantino sat down in front of the world, in front of the cameras, and said things like, "Today I feel disabled. Today I feel like a migrant worker. Today I feel gay." It became a pretty notorious speech, and one that really elevated him into the wider public consciousness, really, and as a controversial figure within football. And as we built towards this summer's World Cup, that of course has now concluded, the theme of his presidency again has been this link with Donald Trump, the US president, particularly since 2024. Trump was a very visible presence at the Club World Cup that became Infantino's big project. It was hosted in the United States, and Trump was there to present the trophy to Chelsea, to some of their bemused players on the platform at the end of that final. We then saw in the draw for the International World Cup, Trump was on stage, and that was where he received that inaugural FIFA Peace Prize in December of 2025. And now we have seen with these plans that Infantino put forward a link to Donald Trump himself in what he was trying to do. The investment group Infantino wanted to lead, this new subsidiary arm of FIFA's commercial side, was led by Joshua Kushner, who is the brother of Donald Trump's son-in-law. So yes, it is a bit complicated, but there is a link there, of course, to Donald Trump. But even him now, even Trump, the US president, has started to kind of tentatively distance himself from Infantino. He said over the weekend that he was not consulted by the FIFA president before these plans were put forward.
Mr Infantino also overturned a red card against the star player for the US side at Mr Trump's behest. So there has been a very close relationship up until very recently between the two men.
Yes, Following Balogun, who received a red card during the last 32 round of the World Cup against Bosnia and Herzegovina, would normally have faced a suspension. But it then emerged that the US president had got involved, had been on the phone to Gianni Infantino, and that suspension didn't happen. Balogun was allowed to play against Belgium in that last 16 game. And that was the key controversy of this World Cup across these three nations. And Donald Trump was at the center of it. It really became a symbol of how intertwined FIFA under Infantino and the US president had become.
Infantino, when he took over from Sepp Blatter, promised to clean up football. But as you say, there have been controversies involving him since he's been FIFA president. Why is it, given that it's only very, very recently that his position as FIFA president has come into doubt?
Well, I think the answer to that is Infantino's key agenda really has been driving money and driving revenue into this organization. We've had those inflated ticket prices for the World Cup, these big broadcast deals, these new tournaments like the Club World Cup, all designed to generate more income. But crucially for Infantino, that revenue goes towards nations to develop their football infrastructure. And for the smaller nations around the world, it is crucial to them. And it in turn leads to approval and votes for Infantino. And in fact, heading towards this election in March of next year, more than 200 of the 211 member nations of FIFA had declared their support for Infantino, including most of them in Europe, including England and Wales and Scotland here in Britain. And that spoke to approval for what Infantino was doing overall, driving money, driving revenue into these nations, and doing so with new projects like the Club World Cup, like the expanded International World Cup, which Infantino led towards being 48 teams.
Could he survive?
It is not easy to oust the current FIFA president. They have to call potentially an extraordinary Congress where then a vote of no confidence could be called. Of course, if Infantino resigns, that undoes all of that. It removes any of that complication. But so far, Gianni Infantino, in his reign as FIFA president, has been defiant. He's not the kind of person you would think who would step away easily. And as I say, Infantino's strategy throughout his presidency has been to keep those smaller nations in particular on board by promising that investment from these big projects down to them. And when UEFA had their meeting, there was some questions over whether the smaller nations in UEFA might actually side with Infantino. You obviously have France and Germany and Spain and England, those huge nations that are always there at the back end of major tournaments. But you also have, Estonia and Latvia and Lithuania, the Czech Republic. But actually, UEFA managed to have complete solidarity and unity in getting those smaller nations on board in unity against Infantino. And in those extremely strongly worded statements, of course, UEFA said they would boycott the World Cup if those plans, those proposals that Infantino put through went through. So, yes, I think Infantino's strategy in terms of getting back on the front foot will be using the mathematics of the 211 FIFA nations to earn support back. There are still some nations in Asia and Africa who are publicly declaring their support still for Infantino. There was Qatar that came forward, Morocco, who is co-hosting the World Cup in 2030. They have come forward and publicly expressed their support for Infantino. So it is not unanimous by any stretch yet. And with FIFA, it is not straightforward in terms of getting to the next phase. So we will see in the next few days how this pans out and how Infantino might deploy a strategy along those lines.
How damaging has this been for FIFA and for football in general?
Well, FIFA, I think from the outside, fans will look at it and say, we're back where we were 10 years ago with Sepp Blatter when he was ousted in disgrace for bribery and corruption that went on at FIFA during his presidency. I think that's why many people, and why UEFA particularly, have expressed that they feel let down by Infantino. He was somebody who promised reform when he came in. He had been a key leader at UEFA for many years before becoming the FIFA president in 2016. And more widely now, FIFA, perhaps there will be pressure for them to have a different model, maybe, that isn't so dependent on the president and really that revolves around this buying off of smaller nations for approval, really. You know, we don't often hear backlash from those nations about governance. You know, we didn't hear backlash on this level around the following Balogun incident, for instance. You know, Infantino was still set to have huge support when it got to March 2027 for the election. Even despite that, it has taken this massive development in the last week for that pressure to really start to be exerted on Gianni Infantino. So yes, there will be perhaps pressure now for a different model at FIFA now, where the president is not all powerful and where perhaps governance and strategy and points of leadership come into play and maybe form a different kind of president and election going forward at FIFA.
Joe, really good to get your thoughts. That was Joe Lynskey from BBC Sport. And if you'd like to hear more from the Global News Podcast, please click on the link below.